The world's attention is increasingly focused on Syria and Iran as the region continues to move toward military confrontation. Less noticed, however, is that the pieces are being put into place for a truly global conflict, with military buildup taking place in every region and threatening to draw in all of the world's major powers. This is the GRTV Backgrounder for Global Research TV. A series of steps towards open confrontation with Iran, Syria, and Pakistan have been making headlines for months now in both the alternative and mainstream media. Covered as essentially separate stories, however, few have so far connected these supposedly isolated incidents into a larger story about the creation of a zone of instability that is in fact engulfing all regions of the globe. When such a picture is assembled, it becomes evident that any number of skirmishes and power grabs taking place around the planet are sparks that could easily light the fuse on open confrontation of the world's nuclear superpowers. In Iran, the U.S. State Department is now admittedly working with the United Nations Assistance Mission in Iraq to relocate the Mujahideen-e-Khalq to a former U.S. military base. The MEK is listed as a terrorist organization on the State Department's own watch list, but Foreign Policy magazine is reporting on the State Department's moves to work with the organization, which has been used as a proxy force to attack Iran in the past. This is in addition to the U.S.'s open cooperation with Jundullah, a Balochi terrorist organization responsible for the deaths and woundings of over 500 Iranian citizens in the past 8 years, including confirmed CIA ties to the group. The MEK revelation comes on the heels of the downing of a U.S. reconnaissance drone in Iran, a drone that was initially said to have been operating exclusively in Afghanistan when it suddenly veered off course, but later admitted to be conducting spying operations on Iran. Now the Iranians are announcing a 10-day naval drill in international waters near the Strait of Hormuz, a strategic choke point for ships transporting petroleum out of the Persian Gulf, a tiny passage through which fully 17% of the global oil transport trade passes each year.
The exercise, bringing Iranian ships into close proximity with U.S. Navy vessels, is being seen as a latest show of strength by Iran in the face of mounting international criticism over its controversial nuclear program.
This comes days after fresh reports of live fire maneuvers by the Syrian Air Force and air defense, which included tracking and destroying hostile targets and firing real missiles. In Pakistan, tensions still simmer from a U.S. NATO airstrike last month that left 24 Pakistani soldiers dead and caused Pakistan to completely close its borders to NATO.
The country's foreign minister told the meeting that Pakistan will fight war on terror on its own terms. She acknowledged that Pakistan's relations with the US are on hold and will be restored only on a clearly defined mandate from the parliament.
Meanwhile, in East Asia, the North Korean military has raised its alert status once again, despite lack of sign of provocation from its neighbors. Tension has flared up across the region as the infamously reclusive North Korean state goes through a precarious handover of power to Kim Jong-il's elusive son, Kim Jong-un. In the Indian Ocean, tensions remain high as China has begun quietly increasing its military presence in the region. Ostensibly there to help fight pirates and protect Chinese export interests, the Chinese Navy has already developed 3 vessels in the Gulf of Aden to combat Somali pirates, and the Seychelles asked the Chinese to establish a military presence in the region during an unprecedented visit by the Chinese defense minister earlier this month. Shortly thereafter, a U.S. MQ-9 Reaper drone was downed in the area. This comes on the heels of President Obama's recent trip to Australia, where he announced the establishment of a permanent U.S. Marine presence in Darwin in what is being seen as the latest step toward a Chinese-American confrontation in the South China Sea.
We are here to stay. This is a region of huge strategic importance to us.
But the region's biggest economic power isn't welcoming the news.
It may not be appropriate to strengthen and extend this military alliance. Whether it suits the common interests of countries around the region and the whole international community remains under question.
Even the Arctic is becoming a potential flashpoint for conflict as Canada begins militarizing the region in a scramble for Arctic resources with Denmark, Russia, and Norway.
A Canadian Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, who campaigned for election on a platform of protecting the North, is aware of the potential economic threat from the Russians, the Europeans and even the Americans. During a 3-day visit to the region, he announces the construction of several polar-class patrol ships and a deep-water port in the Arctic.
The Arctic archipelago is an integral, indivisible part of the true North, strong and free, and that we will not compromise the defense or the sovereignty of Canadian territory.
Earlier this month, I had the chance to talk to Michelle Chosadovsky, Director of the Center for Research on Globalization, about the various conflicts taking place around the globe right now, and how they represent the most worrying moves yet toward a full-scale implementation of World War III.
We are evolving towards an integrated Middle East war theater, Middle East Central Asian war theater, where military initiatives have been taken by the United States and its allies in Pakistan, Iran through covert operations, and Syria through the process of regime change, which is ongoing, but which also consists in supporting insurgent groups within that country and ultimately destabilizing the regime. What must be understood is that all these military as well as covert initiatives are centralized. They're part of a single military agenda. They're not separate initiatives and they're not separate war theaters. So that when we look at Pakistan, Iran, Syria, and bearing in mind that we already have several war theaters which are active within that region, namely Afghanistan, Iraq, and Palestine, of a somewhat different nature, what we get is an extended war theater from the Eastern Mediterranean right through to the Chinese border. All these countries have common borders. Syria has a border with Iraq. Iraq has a border with Iran. Pakistan has borders with Iran and Afghanistan. So that essentially what is likely to occur if a new military initiative is launched is that that whole region will flare up from the Eastern Mediterranean right through to the Chinese border. And I should mention that China and Russia are part of this equation. We are at a very dangerous crossroads. The United States and its allies are waging wars in different parts of the world. They're using sophisticated weapon systems, covert operations, regime change. These are weapons of the 21st century. They contemplate the use of nuclear weapons, ironically against Iran, which does not possess nuclear weapons. These are tactical nuclear weapons which have an explosive capacity between 1/3 and 6 times the Hiroshima bomb, and they are classified, and they have been classified as safe for the surrounding civilian population by the Senate and can be used in the conventional war theater. This is a World War III scenario. It's the globalization of war. It is the long war which was defined in various national security documents, military documents. It's the war without borders contained in the project of the New American Century, which was formulated by the neocons in the year 2000. What we must understand is that these military initiatives, particularly those directed against Iran, Syria, and Pakistan, could unleash a global war. Pakistan is a military power. Iran has advanced capabilities to defend itself, has had very large conventional forces. Syria is a country of more than 20 million population. We have the Russian Navy in the Eastern Mediterranean. China is being threatened by the United States as well in the South China Sea, and in areas adjacent to the Korean Peninsula. And of course, Russia is threatened on its European border in other words, on its western border with the European Union, on the pretext that the missile defense system is directed against Iran, but everybody knows that this is direct against Russia and the former republics of the Soviet Union, many of which are tied into military cooperation agreements with Russia and China under the Shanghai Cooperation Agreement. So we are at a very, very dangerous crossroads. This is the globalization of war. Unfortunately, World War III is not front page news.
Now, many are asking what can be done to avoid this seemingly inevitable march toward full-scale military confrontation in what could easily become the most devastating conflict in the history of the world. According to Rick Rosoff of Stop NATO International in an interview conducted last week, the fact that the anti-war movement has essentially abdicated its responsibilities since the Obama regime came to power means that it will be almost certainly unable to avert this impending crisis.
There are isolated pockets of very dedicated and heroic individuals who are working, and to use your term, doing yeoman service in the cause of publicizing and exposing much of what we've been speaking about. I fear, however, that in the United States, in the West, in the world, there is not a coordinated anti-war movement of the sort that we saw, say, during the Vietnam War in the 60s and early 70s. Anything comparable to, for example, the Stockholm Peace Appeal against nuclear weapons in the early 1950s. It is something on exactly the order of the initiatives I just mentioned that is required and has been required for some period of time. I am deeply disturbed that people who in the past realized the importance of stopping military aggression abroad seem to have placed that issue very low on the list of their priorities, and failed to see that I just mentioned a $662 billion Pentagon war budget for next year. Anyone in the United States that is concerned about funding for education, for health care, for infrastructural repair, for affordable housing, for whatever issues people are concerned about, that's $662 billion, and that's down from an estimated $729 billion this year. This year's Pentagon budget represents roughly $2,400 every man, woman, and child in the United States. Next year's projected budget, even at its base of $662 billion, represents $2,200 for each of the 300 million citizens of the United States. That, if for no other reason, if people are not politically or morally offended by the fact that the U.S. is, through drone attacks, for example, killing people in 6 countries currently, or recently and currently, or that we are inching dangerously closer to a military confrontation with countries like Iran and China and Russia, then the very fact that money that should be available for human needs is being expended for wars abroad ought to evoke a lot more notice and opposition than it clearly does.
As the bleak picture emerges of a world at the point of total war, it remains to be seen what notice, if any, the media will pay to these worrying developments, and whether the public is willing to expend their time and energy on putting together an effective resistance to the global war machine. For more on this story and other breaking news and current events, please go to globalresearch.ca. For more research and analysis by James Corbett, please go to corbettreport.com.